understand the viewpoint of some people who are saying, well, you're always going to need QA people, but in reality, they're filling a QC role instead of a QA role.
Yes.
And that's where the mindset's a little different. You can draw a parallel between software QA to manufacturing QA, where someone comes in and is engineering a production line, and they're there to find out where the bottlenecks are, where the supply problems are, where the build problems are, where the test problems are. And they're at a larger system level of saying, how can we make this product better so when it goes out the door it has fewer defects? And you know that people who make cars and airplanes are seriously into that kind of business.
Right.
So they don't have less responsibility, they have more responsibility because their influence over the operation of the entire environment is a lot larger than just the quality control person that says, you can't get past me to the marketplace until I think I found every bug you've got. And the path you describe of going from quality control manual to quality control automated is really where the marketplace is telling us we need to go now. If you want to stay in the testing, you better be in automated testing, or they're not going to need you in a couple of years.
Right.
So those are the two paths you're going to go.
But you're not doing automated testing with your quality assurance. Your quality assurance is only doing the testing.
Here's the thing. As far as automated testing is concerned, the test teams are writing the QA team is writing tests that they're giving to the developers to automate. So we do have a lot of test automation at this point, even on a system level. And all of those tests come from the quality assurance team. And then the developers will go and automate those scenarios.
Do your developers do unit testing and integration testing, and then in addition to that, they will take the instructions from your QA group and automate those?
Yes.
And who's in charge of your regression and just overall code coverage?
So the
Management of this.
So the management of the regression is basically the QA team will rake all those tests together and say these are the tests that need to be run in regression, and then they'll turn that test plan over to the dev team and say, look, you need to run these, you need to put your results in, and they'll track those results and manage that piece. Really, what we're asking the dev team to do is two things. If they're not going to automate the test, then they need to provide the design steps. And typically what they will do is they'll do the design steps at the time that they're looking at running the test and actually execute the tests. And when they execute the tests, they know where to put the results. QA goes in and rakes all those results together and reports on it and tracks it.
Okay. And at what point do they do the regression test development? Is that after the feature's been developed? Is that while the feature's being developed?
From what it sounds like he's saying, the QA team puts together, this is the list of regression tests that you're going to run for this release. And they put this list together in the planning stages, hand it to developers. You got to run these tests for the regression suite. Now, whether you do it as part of a continuous integration every night or the last week of the release or when you do it, we don't necessarily care, but this is a list, you must run this, it must all pass.
So to give you a little bit more, so as we're going through each sprint, we have our stories that we're building out, we have the acceptance criteria, we have the tests. So we have an existing repository of tests that go back years on our products. So when we think about regression testing on the manual tests, ones that we couldn't automate, we do. We go back to our repository and sample, whether that's a combination of just random sampling as well as targeted sampling based on risk areas.
And who does that function?
The actual selecting of the test?
No,
The run.
selecting, the executing.
The selecting of the test is typically done by QA,
And
and then the development team is responsible for actually running the test.
the manual.
The manual ones.
Okay.
Now, and then the automated ones are automatically being done as our normal regression cycle.
And when are the functional automated tests being developed? At what point?
The functional automated tests are being developed at the same time in parallel the code's done. So within our Scrum story completion environment, the story isn't done until the automated tests or the tests have been completed.
So within your Scrum cycle, your developers are developing the feature, they're writing unit tests, they're writing integration tests, and they're writing functional tests.
Correct.
And then
Manual or automated?
Both.
Could I ask how the organization reacted to this change?
I was Eric's first victim.
Yes, fair point. What do we need QA for?
Did people leave and you had to get the people who could adapt, or did people come around? Took 2 years, 3 years? What?
Well, the economy
Still
wasn't-
coming.
Yeah,
At
the
times. I
economy
mean,
wasn't that great, so we didn't have many people start
Yeah.
out.
It was painful, but let me add what actually I think caused even more pain. A lot of what Eric's doing here is what the goals were, what we had to achieve. We didn't know how to get there. So we're doing Agile, we're learning Scrum, we're actually learning how to build storage and defining requirements, and in many ways I would say we picked up the classic. Here's the book, here's the rules you need to follow. How do you do that? How do you make that work within a development cycle? There was a lot of
I can
pain.
understand that, but I've run into developers who think that testing is beneath them.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Anybody else run into that?
So one thing that
How
helped.
did you take care of it?
So a couple things. One thing that helped is it was a top-down. Our common boss, this was a line in the sand. He doesn't care. He was happy to let people walk out the door or help push them out the door if this wasn't for them. As a manager leading developers, we had to create, and I didn't get to see yesterday's presentation, but an area of quality being part of what you deliver. And that was where it came to. It wasn't so much you're going to do testing, automate it. We, luckily for most of our products, even our UI products today, we're able to automate a large portion of it. So they're still writing code or working with tools to automate the code. And while I think it was painful at the beginning, where the developers actually fell in love with it is about 4 months into some of our projects where they started seeing the results of the regression tests. They break something and see within very short periods of time that there was a problem that needed to be fixed. And that's where the payback, where I think a lot of developers started seeing the value of having the testing in place. While we did do some manual testing, and there's always been, including myself, griping about doing a lot of the manual testing, there's a high level of incentive to try and find ways to automate a lot of it.
And that's generally the way this process works, is when you get these automated tests running, as soon as you get past that pain point of just developing them and get this large suite running, and they run and they catch these issues right away, the light starts to come on these people. Now, the problem is pushing them that far.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll give you a
The skills
So-
in the first place.
Jim has a counterpart in Chicago, and at the time I also had a counterpart in Chicago. So and since I started managing QA, I picked up the Chicago office and the UK office and Croatia, and so on. But at the time, I had a counterpart in Chicago, and I would talk to the counterpart in Chicago because I would say, you know, where are we with the new processes and things? And they would say, well, we're doing Scrum, we're kind of doing Scrum, but as far as the testing is concerned, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And I would say, well, what seems to be the problem with this? And my counterpart would say, well, all of our regression tests are manual, and the developers are unwilling to do the regression tests until they have time to automate them. And basically all that was, they knew they would never have time to automate all the regression tests. So it was never going to happen. Went through a reorg, and I picked up the Chicago office. And at that time, I got on the phone with Jim's counterpart, and I said, look, when are we going to start doing this? You know, when are you guys going to start participating in the test effort? Per our plan, per our common boss, per everything. And she said, well, it can't happen anytime soon until we can automate it. And I said, well, you realize that is your responsibility, and I'm a little tired of doing your job. And so at that point, she said, okay, well, how about we have a compromise? How about I give you 2 people on the team to do the regression testing during your effort? I said, fine. And so what we did was we eased into it in that I had 2 people doing the regression, they had 2 people doing the regression, and half of it was being done by them, and slowly it moved in that direction. But I said, all you need to do is expose developers to the pain of manual testing, and they start thinking about how to automate tests.
Automated testing is a requirement. I mean, to really get dev teams in there, you've got to get into automated
Have,
testing.
have you figured out when a person says it's gonna take me 30 days to develop this, what the additional overhead is to do the automation on there?
So the transition,
some kind of
it's an interesting thing, because I've spent a lot of time with that, because one of the questions I've always asked is I would like to run how we do our quality selection as an ROI. How much money do we want to spend on tests versus the dev, the ratio? I would say that depending on the project and where we're at on it and how we do automation, it's been 30 to 50% of the cycle is around testing and automation. And but the question here is, what makes it hard to figure that out is if we didn't do that, what's the iteration and loss time going back and forth with the testing group? Here's a bug, here it's not, it's intermittent, how are we having trouble finding it? So it's hard to really judge, is it extra or is it not? I mean, I eat it every time, during a sprint and we're doing development, I can see the added time, because we do track the time for our test writing separately than we do from the development. But it's hard to know how much, we don't have a lot of iteration when we hit the end of our cycles. We turn stuff over to a QA group which does a sampling of our tests and then some exploratory testing. And we're down for some fairly large products to just a couple of weeks of regression testing.
You had a question?
Just a comment, because the idea that you're presenting, Lauren and I work on a development team at Pearson that's very close to this idea. Lauren and I are dedicated to test automation,
Okay.
and then we work very closely with the developers. And the developers do their unit and integration testing, and they have continuous integration servers. And then it's just Lauren and I that are dedicated to automating the functional tests. And we actually don't have any manual tests for our product. It's all the automation that Lauren and I do.
That's what I was wondering, how come you guys wouldn't invest in taking your engineers that you have in QA to do the automation for the developers?
Because we want them to produce code too. We don't want
the two
someone
automation
who,
engineers that they had at the start of it moved into the development group. So it's not that they threw them away. No, they brought them over. It's just those were the only two automation people that they had at that time.
Right, but I'm saying about the other quality assurance engineers.
so let's talk about the
Instead of asking
skills.
the developers.
Let's talk about the skills that we typically have in QA. We don't have development resources in QA. I have found the people that I have hired into the QA department since I've taken over is that the majority of them I pulled from some sort of customer support role. And the reason is because they have a customer view of the product. They know how the customers are using the products. Developers tend to look at things from, did I meet the requirements? The customer support person is going to look at it and say, how are our customers doing this? What stupid things are the customers going to do to break this? And so I can easily take someone who has experience as a customer or a customer view of the product and teach them how to write a test and how to articulate that. It's very difficult to disconnect a developer from this is correct and this is how it needs to be done, and take that customer view. So, and this is not just my view, this is the view of my management down, because I was pretty much told that this is how you are going to shape the organization, if you will, as in we will hire QA, this type of person is QA. We don't want anybody in QA who necessarily is a developer by skill. The developers by skill will be in product development, and they will learn to write good code, test their code, and they will execute on the requirements. Where QA is going to try to look at this from a customer view and try to figure out how the customer is going to use it and make sure the developers understand how the customers are using this product. Yes.
That sounds strange, but so you have QA doing the set scenarios, but then you have development saying, okay, we wrote the code, we
they'll go back and they'll look at the tests that the developers ran. And from time to time, they may run it, they may take a test that is an automated test, and they'll go and they'll run it manually to see if it works out. They'll also, QA does go back and they understand, for instance, we have a number of different automated tools where QA may not be able to write the test, but my QA people have been trained enough to understand exactly what's going on in there, and they can look at a test and they can tell whether it meets the scenario or not. So they'll look at a sample of tests, run a sample of tests, it's just to keep the developers honest.
How is your QA team different than a regular project manager?
Excuse me?
How is your QA team different than what's commonly called a project manager, someone who oversees the testing? In a way, it sounds like QA department is pretty much a project manager for testing and development in a way.
Yes, I think that they're splitting their role. Basically, they basically have a split role of test management and process improvement and process enforcement, where yes, project management would be making sure that everybody's on following process and all of that type of thing. I guess the pieces of project management that they're not necessarily involved in, though they understand, for instance, my QA guys are looking at burn down charts a lot, and they're tracking a lot of the metrics around the project. However, when it comes to doing something about that information gets fed either to the dev manager or to me to actually fix, if you will.
Right, so it's kind of like a pseudo tester project manager.
It's a pseudo leadership role, and that's one of the things that was one of the big conversions or mind shifts that the QA people needed to make when we made this shift, was they needed to understand that they were in more of a leadership role than they were when they were testing the product. As you said, most developers view testers on a lower level, and that testing is beneath them. Suddenly, they're in a position where they have authority that's on the same level, if not somewhere above the level of a product developer.
I tend to look at the QA role as they're a quality consultant on the team.
Yeah.
Their job is outside of development because they're not necessarily in it, to look at what do we need to make sure we're building the right product and it's going to work the right way. So I treat them as consultants. I expect them to come to the table with expertise that my developers aren't going to think of.
So I go more customer proxy than product owner type, that they are representing what the customer wants.
Yes. We've had lots of battles around whether QA ought to be product owner, or whether product management ought to be product owner, or development managers ought to be product owner. It's still a debate that goes on every time we start a new project.
There you go.
So, where do we go off the rails here? Because we used to have quality assurance methodologies that were pretty on the forefront of how business is running. Six Sigma, CMM from SEI,
Yes.
and all that. And now we've got an Agile Manifesto, which is kind of like 12 points or 10 points, something like that. And it seems like some of this dropped out of that discussion, and we have to come back and discover what quality assurance is.
Yeah.
How does it fit back into Agile? So what happened there?
Well, I think what happened was that, for instance, if you look at at Enghouse, at least in Phoenix, at least domestically, there is no quality department. So we would have to create a whole new department in order to implement ISO 9001 or CMMI or something like that. So nobody's looking over quality in the first place. From a product standpoint, I think the thing that we noticed is that there's no other department looking at quality. So we needed to morph into that and make somebody focus on that, because for a while there, nobody was focusing on process and on the standards and that type of thing. So I think that's where the thought came from, was that management realized that quality was not a consideration of anyone, and so the logical place to put that responsibility and start focusing on that was in the QA group. And Agile has built into it
probably still using your QA resources as testers after
Sure.
developers have used them,
Yeah.
as opposed to having engineering do the testing.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, you've got to, for instance, one of the things that you'll see in later slides if we get to them is that, you know, management support, support of the business is huge on this. This isn't for everybody. There has to be, management has to make that mind shift in order for it to work out. There will be roadblocks everywhere along the way. There will be resistance to it because people are set in their ways in that way. And for instance, I think it probably works out better for smaller companies than it would for larger companies because, I mean, you take that and you multiply the resistance by that in a large company, you just not get there. Fortunately, the guy in product dev at the top was basically saying, I want change, I want it now, I've had it, and these are the concepts that I want you guys to do. Yes?
Well, one is just a thought. One of the, I like how you're still validating the role of the QA person outside of just development. It's something I'm listening for, and I'm really trying to keep an open mind. And I keep hearing the trend of all QA people should be developers, and I'm trying to be pragmatic about it, but I'm not convinced that that's how it should be. So I'm very interested in how you're maintaining a QA role in this whole process. That's important and valid. I really like that. I'm a little concerned, well, I'm curious, I'll say what I'm concerned about first. I'm concerned about giving authority to a group that has no, giving a role to a group that has no real authority. I don't think that works really well. You end up just giving advice, if you're consulting, you end up just giving advice that has no real backing to it. And people say, thank you very much for sharing, really they can take them in the neck, but you have to be in this meeting, so I just heard what you said, and now I'm gonna go do whatever I do anyway. So I'm kind of like, it kind of sounds a little bit like that to me. And then, on the development side, I can see how it would work smoothly. What I'm curious now, I guess, is what happens if QA continuously finds areas that the developments did not write tests in? Or
The
did not.
development didn't write
Yeah,
tests in?
so what I'm understanding is the QA will write a test scenario and hand it off to a developer who will
Yeah.
encode the details of how to do the, functional
Yeah, so the
speaking.
scenarios will outline all of the scenarios the dev needs to fulfill. So in this model, in a perfect world, right? Development can't miss something because they have to fulfill all the scenarios. It's just like if you're working against a story, right? And you have acceptance criteria that you need to do. You're not done with that story until you've met every acceptance criteria. Well, our tests are the same way. You're not done writing that test until you've met all of those scenarios. Now, on top of that, one of the things that, I guess I'll jump ahead here. One of the things that QA does do at the end of each sprint and at the end of each release is QA does a certain level of user-based exploratory testing.
QA.
And yes, and that is all on them. Okay, they figure out, they're building tests as they're thinking of them, all that type of thing, and they're doing all of that. And we're hoping that covers any scenarios that QA may have missed in the requirements phase of it and in the regression
And
phase.
is that activity done in parallel or on the back end, or is that done as they're writing the scenarios that they're getting on the front end, where, as they're writing the scenarios that they hand off to the developers?
Okay, so here's what so let me try to maybe simplify it this way. We're doing Scrum, which means that all of our sprints start with a list of user stories, right? The sprint can't start, which means development can't start against that sprint until all of the tests are written. Okay, so QA needs to go in ahead of time on the user stories, look at the acceptance criteria, and make sure that they have tests in place that validate all of those acceptance criteria. Okay? And so what happens is that, so when a developer sees that story, the smart developers will go in, the first thing they'll do, they'll look at the test. What am I going to have to do? What is this thing going to look like at the end of the day? Okay?
And what is that delivery
on the story, because our test tools aren't quite integrated with our agile tracking tools yet, really what we have is that we have a series of test tasks, right? And so there will be a test task that says go to test number whatever it might be. You know, in order to validate this, go to test number whatever it might be, and you can actually link into the test tool and just go from there and see what the test looks like. Okay, and so at that point, the development team owns that test from the standpoint of they need to make sure that they do the first run against that. Once they've written a piece of code, they run the test, whatever it might be. So what happens is that typically in a sprint, there are certain phases that QA goes through. QA will go through let's say we typically run month-long sprints. We run, and so first week and a half, QA is going in and doing sample testing and user-based exploratory testing against the features that were developed in the previous sprint. Okay? Toward the middle of the sprint is when sprint planning for the next sprint starts. Obviously, you can't complete all of your sprint planning during that time, but you can get pretty close to what you're doing. And so when sprint planning comes in, QA starts looking at the stories that are going to come in the next sprint, and they start writing the tests against the acceptance criteria. So they may spend the next 2 weeks of the sprint writing tests and making sure that all of the acceptance criteria have tests against them.
Okay, so they spend their iteration, half of it on the back end and half of it on the front end.
Yes.
Is what it sounds like.
Mhm.
And during the back end, if they discover anything, they shoot it back to
Yeah.
the developers to rewrite or
Mhm.
add more.
Yeah, it's opened up
Things
as
like
it's
that?
opened up as a bug against this story or this feature or whatever, and the bug will go onto a backlog. It's put back onto the product backlog, if you
Okay.
will, and then it gets prioritized. And if it needs to go into the next sprint and fixed in the next sprint, it's fixed in the next sprint. If it
So
if
your
it's-
developers will be finding their own bugs, so to speak, within their own sprint, but as long as they find their own issues and resolve it, it never gets written out.
Right.
Anything not caught by themselves goes through this QA
yeah.
cycle and gets written out, and
Yeah.
on it goes. Okay.
Yeah, they're not done with the. So here's the thing. For instance, I mean, I'm the manager, so I don't have a microscopic view into this. But my assumption is that as far as tracking what's going on in a test, at least for that developer test, developers don't mark tests failed. They just don't mark them anything. They go and they fix them, and they aren't done with the story until that test is in a passing phase.
And they can't close the story until all tests pass.
On passing.
So
And
the
that-
stories will get moved over to the next sprint, even if there's one test that's not passing,
Yeah.
they will have to move it until it closes.
Okay.
What's
Okay,
next?
thanks for explaining.
Talk about continuous integration. We did put continuous integration. I think that, from what I understand, most of you are going to be in Jim's class. So I'm going to breeze over this. We do have a concept of an on-demand cycle for continuous integration, night-week builds and weekend builds. And basically, so anytime anything gets checked in, it does get a certain level of, it does go through an incremental build, gets a certain level of unit testing, and some static analysis is run against it. Okay?
Can I just go back? I just wanted to thank you for having that discussion, even though it
Yeah.
kind of derailed you a little bit, because I think what you touched on is sort of what is not really being touched on in the conference, which is
Mhm.
the role of QA in an agile environment, or even in the upcoming next 20 years. And the
Mhm.
message keeps being, all QA people, you are going to be, if you're not obsolete today, you'll be obsolete tomorrow, and you need to be developers. And there may be some truth and validity to that, but there's all, as QA people, we also know there's a lot that's going to be missing if that ever is the truth. And so we kind of skirted it, and we're kind of exploring how you're currently interpreting it. And I've heard lots of different really interesting comments from other people in this room. And for me, that's tremendously valuable, and that's the stuff I'm really, really curious about
steps haven't, I mean, even through all this, the steps haven't changed. It's who, you're trying to talk about who's doing the work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the focus of this is,
You know,
what role is
and
our
I-
people are going to play?
And I think your comment about the multi-hats, you know, it doesn't change, whether it's QA, developer, you know, there's multi-hats somewhere, and I think everybody's needed, and, you know, like in my organization, we kind of are doing what you're saying with the manual to automation. We say, we will run all your automation, and you're stuck with anything you didn't maintain and change because of changes you put in. To me, a bug is a bug is a bug, doesn't matter if the automation didn't work, and you get stuck with the manual. So that's how we get the developers to automate as much as they can. We even stick them with, oh, if you can't automate it because it's print or whatever your reason is, then you're stuck with that as well. But we do run, I mean, they love us just for running the automation, no matter how we do it, whether it's overnight, multiple, you know. And we have the same people that are running the projects and run those on the side and those kind of things. And we have usability and workflow specialists, business project leaders that do some of the other things you were talking about that we do today. Maybe that's the result of a large organization. I mean, you know, you specialize more when you get a little bit more people in your organization. But, I mean, I could see where QA would have all those hats if the company, you know, there would be great value in the company having that.
Okay, so I'm actually going to breeze over continuous integration here. I talked about, so basically I'm also going to breeze over the training piece, because all I did was talk about the different things that, the different types of training that we had to go through. I will just mention that, you know, one of the pieces that we needed to do was we had to get that mind shift in the QA group, where they're spending half of their time doing test management or a little bit of what they used to do and half of their time on process enforcement. Quite frankly, I can't go into a great deal about how we train them on process enforcement and process, because it was a long, drawn-out thing. There was a lot of trial and error. And so from that standpoint, some things worked, some things didn't work, and it was probably, it was, so the specifics around that was we just got it done and we tried a bunch of things. Had to train them on Scrum concepts, and they needed to understand what all the processes were in order to do that. And once again, I touch on, for process enforcement, they really needed to understand how to be a leader as opposed to a ruler in that respect. You had talked about giving authority to somebody who never had that authority or really doesn't have that authority. I will tell you that probably my manager stands behind the QA team, or backs up the QA team more than I ever expected. It was, so they do have the authority, and in many cases, it's weighted in a way that you wouldn't think that it is. With that, you know, when it comes to being a leader as opposed to a ruler, I try to make sure that the QA people, when they're noticing that someone is not complying with the process or adhering to the process, that they're asking questions about what about the process is preventing them from doing it, why aren't they doing it, and what can we do to fix the process to help them comply. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I was ready to see that.
Oh, okay. From the developer standpoint, we just needed to make sure that they were trained up on Scrum, that they understood how to create stories, how they needed to, the importance of tracking your progress on a Scrum project and the up-to-date tracking that you need to do, understanding what the feedback loops were actually telling them when they were doing things like having their daily stand-up and their reviews and retrospectives. Once again, team autonomy was a mind shift that the developers needed to adapt to. A lot of the developers were used to having a dev manager give them their marching orders, go and do suddenly they were in a position where we were trusting them to understand what they do best and figuring out how to get it done in the best way. So they also, since they were taking on testing, they needed to learn use the test management tools and write design steps. This talks about tools. Basically, we've had a defect resolution tool for a long time called Serena Business Manager. As we were working through the Scrum process, we tried ScrumWorks, version 1, and Serena Agile Planner. Eventually, we decided to use Serena Agile Planner because it does integrate with Serena Business Manager. So we're pretty much a Serena house, if you will. All of the tools tend to do the same types of things. I can't necessarily recommend one over the other. They all seem to serve our purposes. As far as test case management is concerned, we are currently using Quality Center. I would love to stay with Quality Center. However, we are unwilling to invest the money in licenses for all of our developers. So we will be moving to Serena Test Case Management fairly soon.
Is Serena open source?
No, Serena is, well, that's the company, and they have a lot of business management tools. And the thing is that we invested, the dev team invested a lot of money in the defect resolution piece, and so we were given a deal on the Agile Tracker piece, and this test case management is fairly new. At the time that we started down this process, Serena didn't offer an Agile tracking tool or a test management tool. As it turns out, the test management tool is free if you own the Business Manager. So the Business Manager is really a workflow, and the test case management is just another workflow that's on top of this. We rolled out the last thing, after we got the documentation in place, we got people trained up and everything, we started rolling out the process. We didn't just roll everything out. This is kind of the order in which we rolled out the processes. The first thing we did was we introduced basic Scrum concepts, got the teams in the habit of holding a daily stand-up, got the teams in the habit of working in iterations and making commitments to getting things done during a specific iteration, and working against stories. It actually wasn't until they had a good concept of Scrum before we started telling the developers that they needed to start testing. That was, once again, that was a very painful process, but we got through it. Usually once the developers found themselves in a position of doing the testing, then they started thinking about continuous integration. There were some teams flipped this process. Okay, some teams were already doing, for instance, Jim's team was already playing with continuous integration, so I believe that they were actually doing continuous integration with the developers testing. And then after those three pieces were in place, we started refining our Scrum processes. As a matter of fact, I think that early on, as far as between sprints, they weren't typically holding us early on. They weren't holding sprint reviews and retrospectives. It was really just getting into the swing of some of the basic concepts. It wasn't until probably 8 months into it that they started doing reviews and retrospectives. So where are we now? What has this gotten us? Well, talked a lot about that we now, our requirements are in user story format. As a matter of fact, product management has gotten involved in our processes, and product management has access to our Scrum tracking tools, and they will go and they will put epics into our Scrum tracking tool so that we can start fleshing them out. We're following Scrum. Developers are doing most of the testing. QA manages the test effort. QA enforces process. We have documented process, so QA can point to different areas of the process when people aren't complying. We have quite a bit more test automation than we had when we started. It's always a give and take, as in you can try to automate everything, and that will, that there's a cost there. And so, we automate when practical. What are our results? The business is definitely much happier with the delivery. I wouldn't say that anything has necessarily changed about how, as far as how long it takes to deliver a feature, if you will. But the thing is that the rest of the business is involved.